Venezuela has the largest reserves of oil in the entire world, more than Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and even much larger oil-rich countries such as the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Despite this, Venezuela does not have a strong economy. In fact, Venezuelans today are markedly worse than they were 20 years ago. So why is Venezuela so poor if it has access to so much money-generating oil? Hello and welcome to Geography by Geoff. Venezuela is a fascinating place. While the country began its life as a colony, it would eventually go on to become the first independent nation in South America. However, the discovery of vast amounts of oil has seen it devolve into an authoritarian petrostate in recent decades, which has ended in the country becoming incredibly poor today. And, as with all of my videos, there's a geographic reason for this. But first, if you're a fan of my videos, consider supporting me over on Substack. Paid subscribers get access to even more geography every week, special callouts, ad-free podcasts, and these extra special perks. So if you want to support my work and get access to all of these extra bonuses, Substack is the place. I'll see you there. Like with most countries today, Venezuela has its fair share of colonial history. But before we get to how the country was shaped by European powers, it's worth highlighting that Venezuela was home to many indigenous civilizations, including the Timodo-Cuica culture. This society was very complex and had pre-planned permanent villages, surrounded by irrigated terraced fields, and many other features that would be common in Europe at the time as well. But while Venezuela was home to an estimated 1 million indigenous peoples, the arrival of Europeans would upend their lives completely. Christopher Columbus first landed in what is now known as Venezuela during his third voyage to the New World in 1498. However, it wasn't until the early 1500s that Spain established their first permanent settlement in South America in the present-day city of Cumaná. This marked the beginning of the Spanish colonization of the region, with the Spanish crown seeking to expand its empire and secure its claims to the New World against other European powers. And as Spain expanded throughout the continent, they would impose their institutions, culture, and religion on the native populations. This would include an economic system known as the encomienda, whereby the crown granted settlers a number of indigenous people from whom they could demand labor or tribute. As the colony of Venezuela expanded over the centuries, Spain would continue to establish new cities and territories. Initially, the region's economy was based on pearl fishing, but later it expanded to include agriculture, livestock, and mining. But as Spain continued to exploit its Venezuelan colony, its people would start to think about what life might look like as an independent country. The first rumblings of independence within Venezuela began in the late 1700s, influenced by Enlightenment ideas of freedom, equality, and self-governance. Along with examples set by the American and French revolutions, the colonists started to question Spanish rule. Discontent was fueled further by heavy taxation and strict trade restrictions imposed by the Spanish crown. On July 5, 1811, a Congress of Venezuelan provinces adopted the Venezuelan Declaration of Independence. This marked the formal beginning of the struggle for a free Venezuela. Simon Bolivar, often called El Libertador, emerged as a key figure in the fight for independence. Initially, he faced several defeats and was forced into exile multiple times. However, his resilience led to the formation of the army known as the Patriots. With Bolivar's leadership, Venezuela would eventually win its war for independence in 1823. Following the war, Bolivar's vision led to the creation of a federation known as Gran Colombia, comprising present-day Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama. However, the federation was short-lived due to internal divisions and political disagreements, and Venezuela would secede from Gran Colombia in 1830, cementing its status as a fully independent nation. Like with many of Spain's colonies, Venezuela would wage a long, protracted war for independence. But while independence was a defining moment for the South American country, it would be the discovery of vast amounts of oil that would shape the Venezuela we know today. But before we get to how oil would change Venezuela, if you're enjoying this video, hit that subscribe button. More fun geography videos are just a single click away. Oil has been a huge economic resource boon for many countries over the last century or so. Countries in the Middle East such as Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran were able to basically fund their entire national budgets on the back of the vast amounts of oil they were able to pump out of the planet. And because these countries controlled so much oil, they were also able to create an organization called OPEC to control and influence oil prices around the world. But while OPEC member states would primarily be based in the Middle East, one of the founding members was all the way in South America, and that country is Venezuela. Venezuela would first discover oil in Lake Maracaibo on its far northeast coast in the early 1900s, but it would take a few decades until the nation would emerge as a significant player in the global oil industry. By the 1930s, Venezuela would become one of the largest oil exporters in the world, with the highest per capita gross domestic product in Latin America. Much of this is due to the oil and significant investment the resource brought from foreign oil companies. But the influence of foreign companies in Venezuela's oil industry generated backlash over time, leading to the nationalization of the oil industry in 1976. After seizing control of the country's oil, the government would establish Petróleos de Venezuela, a state-owned company responsible for the exploration, production, refining, and exporting of oil in an effort to maximize its profit from the oil industry. And for a while, it seemed like Venezuela was going to become one of the wealthiest countries in the world. The oil boom of the 1970s, triggered by a surge in global oil prices due to geopolitical events such as the Arab-Israeli War and the Iranian Revolution, would bring even more money to Venezuela. And with oil revenues filling government coffers, it would lead to a period of significant economic growth for the country. The increased oil revenue enabled the government to fund ambitious development projects, expand public services, and implement extensive social programs. It was during this time that there was a marked increase in living standards, a burgeoning middle class, and an urban migration trend. At this moment in time, Venezuela was one of the wealthiest countries in South America. Unfortunately for Venezuela, their oil fortunes would not last for long as a series of global geopolitical events and continued infighting, corruption, and mismanagement would eventually empty the country's collective pockets. In 1973, Venezuela was producing and exporting 3.5 million barrels of oil per day. But by 2020, that amount had dropped to a little less than 600,000 barrels per day. This is despite the fact that Venezuela has the largest proven reserves of oil of any country on the planet with 304 billion barrels. Put this number in perspective, if Venezuela went back to pumping 3.5 million barrels per day, it would take over 237 years for the country to run out of oil. And while the foundation of Venezuela's wealth was based on its huge oil reserves, this would unfortunately lead the country to an over-reliance on oil as a source of income. This created within Venezuela a commonly known economic effect called Dutch disease, wherein an upsurge of a singular resource leads to a strengthening of the local economy, but also makes other industry sectors less competitive. In Venezuela, the oil sector flourished, but others like agriculture and manufacturing suffered, leading to an economy that was excessively dependent on oil. And it was this lack of diversification in economy that exposed Venezuela when oil prices plummeted in the 1980s and again in the 2010s, causing an economy that was very unstable. It was this economic and social downward spiral that would pave the way for Hugo Chavez to seize power in 1998. Chavez immediately passed laws which expropriated private companies, expanded social welfare programs, and increased state control over the economy. Initially, these changes were popular, but the policies over time severely strained Venezuela's finances and deepened the country's dependence on oil revenues. Following Chavez's death in 2013, his successor Nicolas Maduro continued implementing these policies amidst declining oil prices, which precipitated a full-blown economic crisis. By the mid-2010s, Venezuela was grappling with hyperinflation, critical shortages of basic goods, a collapse of public services, and a drastic surge in poverty rates. This economic crisis, one of the worst in recent history, triggered a mass exodus, with millions of Venezuelans fleeing their homeland in search of better opportunities. Venezuela today is still very dependent on oil for its revenues. While the country isn't producing nearly as much oil today, the industry still accounts for about 95% of all export revenue from the country. This means that Venezuela still hasn't diversified itself enough to ensure a more stable economy. This, combined with the economic policies enacted by Venezuela's current president and sanctions issued on the country by the United States and other Western European countries, has led to hyperinflation rates north of 3,000%. To put this in perspective, the US, which has been suffering from high inflation over the last year, has averaged around 8 to 10% inflation. And this has led to a huge exodus from the country. In 2015, Venezuela had approximately 30.1 million people, but by 2020, that number had fallen to 28.4 million people. Since 2015, Venezuelans have fled to over 90 countries to escape the economic collapse. Between 2015 and 2017, Venezuelan immigration increased by 1,388% in Chile, 1,132% in Colombia, 1,016% in Peru, 922% in Brazil, 344% in Argentina and Ecuador, 268% in Panama, 225% in Uruguay, 104% in Mexico, 38% in Costa Rica, 26% in Spain, and 14% in the United States. The good news in all of this for Venezuela is that the country does seem to have stabilized a little bit. Since 2021, Venezuela's economy has stopped contracting and has begun to grow again. But while that's great for everyday Venezuelans, it will take a long time for the country to emerge from the deep, oil-filled hole it's dug for itself. Venezuela is a tragic example of a country over-relying on a single resource to support its economy. While oil might seem like a boon to a country's pocketbook, not accounting for climate change, it ultimately led to a Venezuela that is poorer today than any of its nearest neighbors. I hope you enjoyed learning more about why Venezuela is so poor despite having so much oil. If you did, please subscribe to my channel. And if you want to watch more of my videos, you can do so here. Thanks for watching. See you next time.